lives of those that we take this message here and share to those who don't know you. Lord, thank you. Thank you for everyone here and everyone online. Thank you for David and Marilyn for the time they set aside, and David for studying to come in here and enable us to give an answer for the hope that's within us. So, Father, thank you for what you are doing. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, David.
Thank you. And welcome to How to Make Sense of the Bible. Take your Bible and turn, if you would, to Exodus chapter 18. Let me just say to relax you. I don't expect you to remember every detail. So there will be an exam at the end, mind you. But what is important is that you get the big picture. The details, I'll help you out when we get to the end of the series with what we can do to help you out there. But what you're interested in is getting the big picture. We're thrilled to have a group here. We're thrilled to have a large group online, and happy about that. So last week we made it to Mount Sinai, and we had to park there. But when you come in Exodus to chapter 18, you well could, or 18, 19, you well could call this How to Meet God. Because when you come here, you're coming to the location is a large bush-studded area. It's 2.5, it's 2 miles long. It's half a mile wide. Surrounded by mountains 8,000 feet high that go up like a fist, called Mount Sinai, and it's a perfect amphitheater area. Now, when you come to Mount Sinai and here Moses is going to meet with God, I want you just to notice in chapter 19, let's pick it up in verse 5, how to meet God, because he gives us some real good insight here, and he says in verse 5, he says, now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations, you will be my treasured possession. So first of all, there's a willingness to obey. Let me just say one other thing here. Notice that over and over and over and over again, he's talking about nations. So when you move from Genesis 11, where the nations are scattered, to Revelation 22, where the nations are brought together, now, God bridges the in-between, and that is the main narrative of the Bible. We get all hung up on a person. It's the nations that God's specifically interested in, and we'll read that over and over and over again, the nations. So he says, now, if you obey, so first of all, the willingness to obey, and if you do, you'll be my treasured possession as a nation. Then down in verse 9, he talks secondly here about listen. He says, be sensitive to listen, because he says this. The Lord said to Moses, I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud so that the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust. So he says, that will cause them to believe in you. So he says, first of all, how to meet God. Needs to be a willingness to obey. Second, they need to be sensitive to listen. Thirdly, he says, consecrate to your hearts, because he says down in verse 10, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes. And be ready the third day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. Put limits for the people around the mountain and tell them, be careful that you don't go up the mountain or touch the foot of it. And then come all the way to verse 23. Fourthly, he talks about having a deep respect for God's presence. Moses said to the Lord, now the people cannot come up Mount Sinai because you yourself warned us. Put limits around the mountain and set it apart as holy. And he goes on. Now, then you have the 10 Commandments. And here you have the tablets, which provided a way to life. In a moment, you have the tabernacle, which provided a way to worship. So one provided a way to life, the other provided a way to worship. And so he lists them here. He talks about God's uniqueness, one God. He talks about God's worship, one way. He talks about God's holiness, my name. Talks about God's day, rest and enjoy. Talks about family relations, human life, marriage, personal property, personal integrity, or rather personal contentment. Now, it's interesting when the Ten Commandments are given. Then they add what we call the Mosaic Law. And the Mosaic Law is, well, then how are you going to take these 10 commandments and how are you going to instruct them and give rules to applying them? And they had 613 laws added to the 10 commandments called the Mosaic Law that are there to work this out. Now, that's interesting because David come along and he reduced the number. Isaiah comes along, he reduced them even more. Micah comes along, reduces them to 3. Habakkuk comes along and reduces them to 1, which is repeated 3 times in the New Testament. And you remember the one that we all remember. Remember when Jesus is asked the question? And the question is, now, of all these laws, so maybe the questioner had in mind the 613, which would be the most important of all of them? And you remember the answer when Jesus said, love the Lord thy God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with everything that's in you, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, I remember preaching for a call at a church that I said no thanks to. The bank manager in town was the chairman of the board, was sitting at the end of the table. I was waiting for him. I was a young fella. I thought for sure he was going to call me boy because he had his glasses down at the end of his nose and looking over them. But he invited me down to the bank on Monday morning, so I went down. He gave me a book. It was one of the best books anybody ever gave me, and that's what it was on. Because that's exactly, have you ever gone to a church that's in trouble and you hear a preacher, maybe a visiting preacher, telling the people that they need to love each other? He might as well have taken that and told everybody to go to lunch. That's not how you start. You start by people got to get loving God first of all. Then they get to loving one another, and then they can get to loving the unsaved world. And it's always in that order. And so he gives the great command. Now, then he goes from here, and he goes in the next chapters, he goes to the tabernacle. Let's go to chapter 26. When you come to the tabernacle, that provided a visible way to worship. And the tabernacle was made up of 3 sections. You had the outer court, which had this picket fence, if you will, a glorified picket fence, 150 feet long, 75 feet wide, 7.5 feet high. And then in the middle of that glorified picket fence, if you will, there's a tent. The tent has 2 rooms with a heavy veil in between. So you have the holy place on the one side, and you have the Holy of Holies on the other side. So let's say you're going to go to church in Old Testament days. It wasn't such a thing as church, but you're going to go to the tabernacle, which would be the closest that we would have. You would take a lamb with you. That lamb would be presented to the priest. The priest, then you bring that lamb in, and there's like this, like a barbecue pit, if you will. You present the lamb on there. You place your hands on that lamb while that lamb is slain to identify with your own sins. That lamb is then placed on there. Behind that, it's like a bird bath, if you will, where the priest is washing his hands. And that all takes place there. And then once a year, nobody but the priest could go into that holy place. And if you went in other than the priest, you would die. And so it lays out the furniture. The Ark of the Covenant is in there. The mercy seat is in there. And once a year, we know it as Yom Kippur, the priest would go into that holy place and offer there the lamb for one lamb. Remember we talked about last week? One lamb, one person, Cain and Abel. One lamb, one family, the Passover. Yom Kippur, it's one lamb, one nation. And so when the priest offered the lamb in there on the mercy seat, that is for the sins of Israel. And then, of course, the New Testament, one lamb for the entire world. So they're in that tabernacle. Now, when you talk about the tabernacle, that tabernacle, they spent about a year at Mount Sinai. They're hammering out a way of life, civil government, religious government, pattern of life. Leviticus, there's 27 chapters that detail that. There's 9 chapters in Numbers that give the rules and regulations. And all of that takes place there. And then you have, after spending a year at Mount Sinai, with the 10 Commandments now that come down with Moses on tablets, with the mindset of the blueprint for the tabernacle. The tabernacle is built, and by the way, it took about 6 months to build the tabernacle. It was built with willing hands and willing hearts. And Scripture says that God observed every gift that was given to the building of the tabernacle. So however small or however large your gift was, God noticed it that you brought for that. So it goes through and it talks about the furniture, talks about the preparation of the priests, goes through all of that. Now, come if you would with me to the book of Numbers. We haven't spent any time in the book of Numbers, but we need to spend a moment there. Come to the book of Numbers, and come if you would to the end of chapter 9. Numbers chapter 9. Verse 15 says this: On the day of the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony was set up. The cloud covered it. From evening till morning, the cloud above the tabernacle looked like fire. Remember now, you have a cloud of fire at night, and you have a cloud of shade during the day. When they're going across the desert, 120 degrees Fahrenheit, they were shaded with that cloud. At night, it was like a flashlight for them. But it says now, the cloud covered it from evening till morning. The cloud above the tabernacle looked like fire. Come down to verse 20. Sometimes the cloud was over the tabernacle only a few days. At the Lord's command, they would encamp. And then at the command, they would set out. Sometimes the cloud stayed only from evening till morning. And when it lifted in the morning, they set out. Whether by day or by night. Whether the cloud lifted, they set out. Whether the cloud stayed over the tabernacle for a few days, or a month, or a year, the Israelites would remain in camp and not set out. But when it lifted, they would set out. So that's their marching orders. When the cloud leaves, they leave. Cloud stays, they stay. Then it moves along, and you have the Israelites in chapter 10, verse 11. They're leaving. It says, on the 20th day of the second month, the second year, the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle of the testimony. And then the Israelites set out from the desert of Sinai, traveled from place to place until the cloud came to rest. It goes on and tells. Now, they are on their way, 150 miles. They're heading to a place called Kadesh Barnea. And on the way, an absolute shocker takes place in chapter 11. You probably have never heard of this. It says, now the people complained. Can you imagine? The people complained about their hardships in the hearings of the Lord. That ticked off God. Verse 4. The rabble, now that we would call them the riffraff, with them began to crave their other food. And again the Israelites started wailing and said, if only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost, also the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now we've lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna. Now, poor old Mrs. Moses had 285 recipes on how to cook manna. You could boil manna, you could broil manna, you could barbecue manna, you could deep fry manna. I mean, all the ways you could eat manna, but they're getting tired of eating manna. So they start complaining. It says they cooked it in a pot or made it in cakes. They tasted it, something made with olive oil. When the dew settled on the camp at night, the manna also came down. Now, Moses has got too much weight on him. And it says that Moses was troubled, verse 10. Come down to verse 12 and says, did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms, as a nurse carries an infant, to the land you promised on oath to their forefathers? Where can I get meat for all these people? They keep wailing to me, give us meat to eat. I can't carry all these people myself. The burden is too heavy for me. If this is how you're going to treat me, put me to death right now. Now Moses has reached a point where he's trying to do too much, so God's going to take care of him. Verse 18, tell the people, consecrate yourselves, preparation for tomorrow, when you'll eat meat. The Lord heard you when you wailed, if only we had meat to eat. We're better off in Egypt. Now the Lord will give you meat, and you'll eat it. You'll not eat it for just 1 day or 2 days or 5 or 10 or 20 days, but for a whole month. Now notice verse 21. Moses said, here I am among 600,000 men on foot. That's where we get the idea that there's around 2 million. What does it say there? It says 600,000 men, plus the women, plus the children. I will give them meat to eat for a whole month. Would they have enough? No. Here's this question. If the flocks and herds were slaughtered for them, would they have enough? If all the fish in the sea were caught up, how in the world are you going to get enough people for a month's food for 2 million people? Moses said, I mean, that's impossible. Look around. There's not enough meat here. And then God answers, is the Lord's arm too short? Verse 23, you will now see whether or not what I say will come true for you. Now, 2 fellows, verse 26, Eldad and Medad, they're hanging out in the camp, and they start prophesying in the camp. And good old Joshua, I want you to notice this, verse 28, Joshua, the son of Nun, he sounds like when you say that he didn't have any parents, son of Nun, who had been Moses' aide since youth, spoke up and says, Moses, my Lord, stop them. Don't let them away with this. You're the prophet here. You're the one in charge. But Moses replied, are you jealous for my sake? I wish that all the Lord's people were prophets. The Lord would put his spirit on them. Then verse 31. Now the wind went out from the Lord and drove quail in from the sea. Brought them down all around the camp to about 3 feet above the ground, as far as a day's walk in any direction. Now here's what happens. Quail comes down. It's 3 feet high, piled up with quail. It's as far as a day's walk in any direction. And there was enough for 60 bushels for every person to go and gather up. So they've got enough meat now, God provides, for an entire month. Then chapter 12. Just park here for a second. Verse 1. Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses. And so you got some sibling rivalry takes place here. And they're kind of saying, well, nobody asked us our opinion. Nobody ever asked us. And in fact, let us tell you a few things about Moses. Now, when anybody comes along and slanders, there's a great lesson here to learn. Whenever somebody slanders somebody, there's always a gossiper and a gossipee. Remember this. There's always a gossiper, and there's always a gossipee, and there's always the Lord in between the two. Always in a slander. So they have to work that out. Miriam gets struck with a leprosy and has to stay outside the camp. And then in chapter 13, this is one of, everybody knows this story, Kadesh Barnea. Now, Joshua, or rather Moses here, I'm getting to Josh too quick, Moses here, he decides to send some men to explore the land of Canaan. And so he goes through the 12 tribes and picks one from each tribe. So he's got 12 men. And he says to the 12 men, now here's what I want you to do. I want you 12 men to go down to the promised land, check it out. Then come back and give us a report so we know what's ahead of us. So they go. Down they go. And let's pick it up in verse 23. When they reached the valley of Eshcol, they cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. Now think about this. 2 of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates and figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol because the cluster of grapes the Israelites cut off there. At the end of 40 days, they returned from exploring the land. By the way, do you think there's going to be any issue with enough food to eat? Sure doesn't sound like it, right? So they found to go down, they found that it is a land flowing with milk and honey. They come back. Now, when they come back, there's a majority report and there's a minority report. 10 people give a majority report, and they say this, verse 27. They gave Moses this account. We went in the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here's the fruit. But, the people who live there are powerful. The cities are fortified and very large. By the way, Jericho, which we're going to see in a moment, Jericho was fortified, looked impenetrable. And so they're given this account. And we even saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in there, and then it goes on and lists all the ites. You got the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites. They all live in the hill country. And the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. We got a problem. People all over the place. Then Caleb silenced the people. So the majority report says, now, there's lots of opportunity there, but there's a real problem. There's a real problem. There's all kinds of people there. We don't have a chance. Now, Caleb speaks up and gives the minority report. Silenced the people before, verse 30, Moses, and said, now, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. But the men who have gone up with him said, we can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land that they had explored. And they said, the land we explored devours those living in it. And all the people we saw there are great size. And he goes on and he says, we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. So those are like giants down there. And we're like grasshoppers. I can remember taking a class on church business. And the professor asked this question. He said, if you were going to discern the will of God for a decision that you're going to make in a congregation, how many people believe that you take a vote to discern the will of God? Everybody raised their hand except one. He said, how many people don't believe that? One person raised their hand. I know the person fairly well. And then the professor said, okay, Johnson, why not? I said, the story of Kadesh Barnea. How did Moses get in trouble? By taking a vote to discern the will of God. And what was the result? The result was, he goes on to say in verse 29 of chapter 14 this, in this desert your bodies will fall. Every one of you 20 years old or more who was counted in the census and who has grumbled against me, not one of you will enter the land that I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except Caleb and Joshua. Everybody else is going to die in the desert because of their refusal to believe the will of God. And so here you had all these people that they never dreamed anything, they never risked anything, and they went as low as you could go. And they didn't trust God, they didn't believe God, and they didn't follow God, and so they land in the desert. Now, come with me. At the moment, we're going chronologically. Just go to your right again to the book of Joshua. To the book of Joshua. I don't know where I am in my notes because I left them a long time ago. Okay, so let's come to the promised land. The book of Joshua is the counterpart to the book of Exodus. In the book of Exodus, you have God bringing them out of bondage. In the book of Joshua, you have God bringing them into the land of blessing. In the book of Exodus, you have God parting the Red Sea for them to cross across. In the book of Joshua, you have God parting the Jordan River for the people to cross across. So Exodus and Joshua are counterpart books. Now, in this book, it's interesting. You have twin miracles, falling walls, and a standing still sun. You have the salvation of a harlot named Rahab. In chapter 1 here, he talks about, if you want to alliterate, you have the preparation that takes place. God speaks in the first verses of chapter 1. Verse 11, rather. Let's pick it up in verse 10, actually. Joshua speaks. And Joshua ordered let's back up to verse 1. After the death of Moses, should stop there. Back up in chapter 34 as we end the book of Deuteronomy. When you come to the end, notice in verse 10 of the chapter 34 of Deuteronomy, verse 5. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. So Moses dies. And then it goes on in verse 7 and says, and Moses was 120 years old when he died. Yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over. Now, Moses doesn't get to go into the promised land. Does he ever get to go in the promised land? Yes. 1,300 years later, at the Mount of Transfiguration. Remember, Moses came down? But it's not until then. And so God is speaking then in Joshua. God is speaking to Joshua, and he said, the Lord said to Joshua, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, when you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River in the land I'm about to give to them, to the Israelites, I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. And so he challenges Joshua. And then that famous verse, verse 8, don't let this book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Verse 10, so Joshua ordered the officers of the people. And he tells them, now get ready, get ready. So he sends us a couple of spies down into Jericho, because Jericho is the city that they're going to have to capture, and it's a fortified city, so he sends a couple of spies down. Now, the king gets word of it, and so they have to hide out at Rahab's house. Now, when they hide out at Rahab's house, they are hiding out there. Rahab, this is interesting. Rahab's a harlot. In that culture, they glamorized abuse. They idolized immorality. They worshiped wickedness. They did human sacrifices. They did sexual orgies. That was all part of their religious expression. Everyone in her life is a Canaanite, and she's longing for a change. And Rahab is trapped in a life she doesn't want. After all, who's going to help a prostitute? Then enter divine history. So these two spies that Joshua has sent down, they come to Rahab's house and they want to hang out, so she takes them up on the roof, remember? And she hides them on the roof. Now they make a deal, and the deal they make is verse 12. Now then, she says, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I've shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father, mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. They agree, our lives for your lives. And so they make the agreement. Then chapter 3. Chapter 3. Get ready, because God's about to show off. And there's a breakthrough that's coming. Joshua, well, let's go to verse 1, chapter 3. Early in the morning, Joshua and all the Israelites set out from Shittim and went to the Jordan, where they camped before crossing over. After 3 days, the officers went through the camp, giving orders to the people. Verse 5, Joshua said to the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you. He says he's going to part the waters of the Jordan River, and we're going to cross over. And so he says now, verse 6, take the Ark of the Covenant, pass on ahead of the people. So they took it up and went ahead of them. Verse 10, this is how you will know that living God is among you. And so he'll drive out the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, and the Amorites, and the Jebusites, and all the otherites. And says, now, see, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. Now then, choose 12 from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe. And as soon as the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, set forth in Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap. So when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, priests carrying the ark of the covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan is at flood stage. Isn't that interesting? All during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan, and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing, piled up in a heap a great distance away, and so the people, the end of 16, crossed over opposite Jericho. And they stood firm on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan. So they cross over. Now, the next thing in chapter 4 that he asks them to do, which is interesting, he says, now you need to get 12 stones, one for every tribe, and you need to create a memorial. Why do you create memorials, remembrances in your life? The reason is, if God did this yesterday, I can count on God to do it tomorrow as well. And so that'll always be a reminder. And so you can go in your own life. You can go back in your own life. And when you go back in your own life, there's certain places, there's certain events, there's certain perhaps memorials that are there that you say, well, I remember at this place, at this time in my life, this is what God did in my life. And that's what that is all about. And so then that is all laid out there. And now, then you have something, they're in the promised land. The plan in chapter 6, when they get into the promised land, when you read chapter 6, you got to say, you've got to be kidding, God. I mean, when you read chapter 6, this is the first recorded psychological warfare ever recorded. So God says, no, this is what you're going to do, verse 2. The Lord said to Joshua, see, I've delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its kings and fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. So every day for 6 days, you go around the city once. Then he says, verse 15, on the 7th day, they get up at daybreak, because this is what they're told to do. Because let me back up to verse 4. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of rams, horns in front of the ark. And on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing the trumpets. And when you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have all the people give a loud shout. And then the wall of the city will collapse. Now, can you imagine if you're one of the Israelites? You have got to be kidding. We're going to march around Toronto. And Trump's built a wall around it. And we're going to march around there. And we're going to, do that every day from Monday to Saturday. And then Sunday we're going to go around 7 times, blow the trumpets. And when we yell, the wall's going to fall down. Verse 15, on the 7th day, they got up at daybreak, marched around the city 7 times, same manner, except that on that day they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, the priest sounded the trumpet blast. Joshua commanded the people, shout, for the Lord has given you the city and all that was in it, able to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who were with her in the house shall be spared, because she hid the spies. Verse 20, and when the trumpet sounded, the people shouted, and the sound of the trumpet, when the people gave a loud shout, the walls collapsed, so that every man charged straight ahead and took the city, and they devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with sword every living thing in it, men, women, young and old, cattle, sheep, donkeys. And Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, go into the prostitute's house, bring her out, and all who belong to her, according with your oath to her. And so that happens. Now, in the rest of the chapter, you have, by the way, in chapter 8, that's just a side thing. We usually say in chapter 8, I don't know why, we pronounce it Ai. That's not the right way to pronounce it. You pronounce it I. So if you get somebody that's particular about that, that's how they will pronounce it. It's pronounced just I, not AI, as we normally call it. But so you have here, you have the possessions. Israel conquers the possessions. And then you have Israel colonizes its possessions. And you have in the rest of, in Joshua, you have, okay, this tribe takes this parcel of land, this tribe takes this parcel of land. Come on to the next book, if you would, to the book of Judges. Come to the book of Judges, and let's spend a moment here. In the book of Judges, you have a sad, dark period begins. And the root of Israel's problem is this. When Joshua died, God couldn't find anybody to take over after Joshua dies. So Joshua dies. And notice it says in Judges chapter 2, because let me just say, in Judges you have a couple of problems. One's compromise. They were not doing what God said to do. And there was apostasy. They were doing what God said not to do. So you have both sides going on. But in verse 8 of chapter 2, Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. They buried him in the land of his inheritance. Now, verse 10. After that, the whole generation had been gathered to the fathers. Another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served Baals. They forsook the Lord. Verse 14. In his anger against Israel, the Lord handed them over to raiders who plundered them. That's a word that you read over and over and over again in the Old Testament. Plundered. Then the Lord, verse 16, raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of the raiders. Yet they would not listen to the judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshiped them. Unlike their fathers, they quickly turned from the way in which their fathers had walked, the way of obedience to the Lord's commands. So here you have them. Israel is constantly battling the occupying or the enemy nations. And so this goes on. You read in the book of Judges over and over again, everybody was doing that which seemeth right in their own eyes. And so Israel now has forsaken God. So God's going to have to do something. In these, what we call the history books, you have an incredible book called the Book of Ruth. And the Book of Ruth gives us a wonderful picture, if not the best picture in all the Bible, certainly in the Old Testament, of the kinsman redeemer. We'll come to that next week when we talk about the return. But the kinsman redeemer in the book of Ruth is Boaz. Ruth's a picture of the church, and the kinsman redeemer, Boaz, is a picture of Christ, who then will redeem Ruth, which is a picture of how Christ will redeem the church. We'll see all of that as we go along. So the book of Ruth is a gem in this very dark and very sad period. Israel, they have these judges, but they don't obey the judges through the book of Judges, just judge after judge after judge. You have Israel wants a king because they see the other countries have, other nations have kings. And so God gives them a king, King Saul. Then he's replaced by King David. Then King David is replaced by King Solomon. Solomon's key to success was his insatiable desire for wisdom. Now, that's why you have the books in the Bible on wisdom. For example, Ecclesiastes, the Song of Solomon, Proverbs. Now, when you think about that, every culture, every nation, in every culture, is going to have issues. And so they didn't go to the library and get books in that day. They would get together and talk. Now, Solomon stood out amongst the wise men. Why? Because Solomon alone feared God. Now, Solomon was interested, and he had this incredible desire for wisdom, and so he was looking for value and worth in life. His problem was he also had an insatiable desire for women, and he had many of them. And it wasn't just women in Israel that was his problem. It was women outside of Israel that he brought in. And so God then finally has to judge Solomon. And Solomon's failure was he loved all of these women until the kingdom was taken from him. So his personal problems led to his public splitting. And so you have Israel's sin. The same people who enjoyed the greatest benefits of God's redeeming deliverance, who were delivered from oppression and injustice and economic exploitation, went on to allow these same things to poison their own life. Now, why all the drama? Why all the drama? You're reading along in the Bible, Israel is up here and God's blessing them. And then you have Israel down here and they're disobeying God. Then they get right with God, they come back up. And you have this going on and on and on through the rest of the Old Testament. Why all the drama? Well, maybe you ask yourself the same question. Why all that drama in my life? There's times in my life when I'm really walking close with the Lord. Then there's other times in my life when I'm struggling. And why do I go back and forth? Now, that's part of spiritual warfare. And this drama goes from Genesis to Revelation, meaning this. God's plan of redemption required the existence of a nation and the continuation of a nation. And so if you want to destroy that nation, you would destroy God's plan for the world. So we've already seen creation, Genesis 1, and you have the triune God, let us make man in our image. And so man is made. Man is given a helper, Eve. In chapter 3, we're introduced to the serpent. And the serpent causes the woman to sin. And Adam sins. Then you have that proto-evangelium verse, Genesis 3:15, where we're told that from the seed of a woman is going to come one. And he's going to crush the head of the serpent, but in doing so, he's going to bruise his own heel. Now, from the seed of a woman. Then you get over to Genesis 4. You have Cain kills Abel. Then the story shifts to Seth. Then you have the wickedness in chapter 6, and God has to bring a flood, but he saves Noah and his family. Why? Because you got to save the seed. Then you get, the scattering. And you get, even before the scattering, you got Jacob and Esau in there. And Esau wants to kill Jacob. Why? Because Jacob is the son of promise. You have all of this going on all through the Bible, and it is always the same thing. That if the enemy, being the serpent, if he can take out the seed, the nation, then he can take out God's redemptive plan for the entire world. And that's what's going on here as you're going through that. When you get in Exodus, what does Pharaoh try to do? He tries to remove all the male children. Herod's going to do that later when we get to the New Testament. And so it's just one after another after another. Now, the nation that brings forth the deliverer, and that's not Moses, that's Jesus Christ, that the nation's going to bring forth. That's who the seed is going to come through. And there's this spiritual warfare again and again and again and again, and that is always that reason. And so you'll see it. Watch the nations. That's what's taking place. Then you have God judges, and the exile takes place. Raised huge questions about God in the minds of Israel. From the book of Exodus onwards, these nations are playing a major part in the biblical narrative. And we kind of talked about to that. In Deuteronomy 9, God was using Israel as the agent of God's judgment against the Canaanites. Later, the Amalekites, the Moabites, the Amorites, all because of their wickedness. They were destroyed under God's judgment. The lesson that Israel had to learn was that if God could use Israel as an agent for his judgment against these nations, he could always also do the opposite. He could use them against Israel if he needed to judge Israel, which is exactly what he did. I don't know if you want to turn there. Let me read you a couple of verses. Amos said this in chapter 6, verse 14. He said this, For the Lord God Almighty declares, I will stir up a nation against you, O house of Israel, that will oppress you all the way from Lebo Hamath to the valley of Arabah. Let me read you another one from the book of Isaiah. In the book of Isaiah, I'm reading from chapter 10, and it says this: Woe to the Assyrian, the rod of my anger, in whose hand is the club of my wrath. So God is like a chessboard, using these nations and moving these nations around and dictating history. And so when God decides to use the Assyrians against the Israelites, he says, they're just like a club in my hand. They're nothing more than that. And so God uses them to judge Israel. Now, as this is going on, and as it's taking place, come with me to the book of Ezekiel, because Ezekiel speaks a lot on this. The book of Ezekiel. Let's come to Ezekiel chapter 18. In Ezekiel 18, let's pick it up in verse 21. It says this: But if a wicked man turns from all the sins he has committed and keeps all my decrees and does what is just and right, he will surely live. He'll not die. None of the offenses he has committed will be remembered against him. Because of the righteous things he has done, he will live. Do I take any pleasure in the death of the wicked, declares the sovereign Lord. Notice that? Do I take any pleasure in the death of the wicked, declares the Lord. Rather, I am not pleased when they turn. Rather, am I not pleased when they turn from their wicked ways and live? But if a righteous man turns from his righteousness and commits sin and does the same detestable things the wicked does, will he live? None of the righteous things he has done will be remembered because of the unfaithfulness he is guilty of, and because of the sins he has committed, he'll die. And he says that back and forth, back and forth, and back and forth. I don't take any pleasure, he says, in the death of the wicked. I don't take any pleasure. Now, Ezekiel said this. Ezekiel said, the worst moment in my life, other than perhaps my wife's death, was when I saw the glory of God depart from the house of God. That was the worst day of my life. The generations after Moses, failures to stay loyal to what covenant that God had made with them, led to the judgment of God as the nations watch with astonishment. Israel, now notice this, Israel lived in a crowded international stage in the land of Canaan, as the land bridge between three continents. Therefore, chosen by God, Israel was to affect the other nations, who were spectators of the mighty acts of God. Thus, the nations are called on to reflect on what they had seen and draw conclusions about the power of Yahweh. Israel had profaned the name of God. Terrible damage is being done to God's reputation, and he's being reduced to one among many defeated gods, being swallowed up by the Babylonian war machine. Now, come with me to the book of Jeremiah, because I want you to see the heart of God. Book of Jeremiah. I want to just wander around here a little bit. In Jeremiah, if you can find it, chapter 18. Book of Jeremiah. Let's pick it up in chapter 18, a very familiar chapter. A couple of spots here we'll look at, but let's start with chapter 18. In chapter 18, you have the potter's house. Now, after visiting a potter at work, notice what it says. Chapter 18. This is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Go down to the potter's house, and there I'll give you my message. So I went down to the potter's house, and I saw him working at the wheel. But the pot he was shaping from the clay was marred in his hands. So the potter formed it into another pot, shaping it as seemed best to him. And then the word of the Lord came to me, O house of Israel, can I not do with you as the potter does? Now, isn't that an amazing metaphor? In other words, God says this, I was going to bring judgment on you. Then I saw a change in your life. And when I saw change in your life, it's no different than a potter shaping that pot of clay. When he saw a defect, if he corrected that, then something wonderful came from that clay. And he says that's exactly how God treats us. Now, when he gives that to us, that metaphor, means that God can change his intention. Come to the, well, you don't even need to come there because you know the story, the book of Jonah. Remember how God says to Jonah, now, Jonah, I want you to go and I want you to preach to the people of Nineveh because the people of Nineveh are wicked and they need to hear the gospel. And Jonah says, I don't want to go to the Ninevites. If I'm a failure, this is what they do. They'll cut your head off, they'll behead you, they'll drain the blood, and they'll use that as a brush, and they'll paint graffiti on the wall with the blood from your head. I don't want to go anywhere near them. And if I'm successful and I preach and they repent, because I know how you are, God, you're going to forgive them, and we don't like them. So I don't like this if I'm a failure, and I don't like this if I'm success, so I'm not going. And so Jonah goes the opposite way, but he forgot one thing, and that is he forgot his theology. And that is the omnipresence of God, because no matter where you go, God's waiting there for you to welcome you. So God eventually takes Jonah to Nineveh. And when he gets there, do you remember at the end of the chapter? Jonah is sitting in the heat of the day, and he's looking for some shade. And God causes this vine to grow up. And it caused shade for Jonah, and Jonah's sitting in the shade, and he's chilling. And he's thinking, like, this is good, this is good. And then God sends a worm along, and that worm eats the vine. And the sun starts to beat on Jonah. And Jonah gets ticked off. And God says to Jonah, because he's just using an object lesson, he says, now, you got all upset about this plant that you never planted. You had nothing to do with it growing. And you got all upset about that. But what about me with 120,000 people over here, men, women, and children that need to be saved, and you're upset because I'm caring for them, but you got all upset about a plant. So God, again and again, God shows mercy. Now, the point here is this. The covenant demands two sides. Israel belongs to Yahweh. Yahweh belongs to Israel. And Israel, instead of being, as Exodus 19 said, a priestly nation, have drifted from that. So we come along, and as we come along to, in this exile, as we come along there, we have Israel's condition. Her appetite for worship was insatiable, but their lives denied the moral standard of God. She had plenty of religious zeal. She had plenty of atonement in many sacrifices. She had plenty of assurance of salvation from affirmations at the temple. She had plenty of religious observations at holy festivals. Spiritual religion flourished amidst national rottenness. And God, Malachi 1:10 says he hated it and finally wiped it out. The sin of Israel was so grotesque, so scandalous, and so unrepenting that it left God no alternative but to scatter them among the nations in the curse of the exile as he had warned them. Israel was defeated. God's city was destroyed. So you have then three distinct phases in Babylonian captivity. Israel went into exile like the Egyptians, Canaanites, the Syrians. In 605 BC, Daniel and the others were carried away. When you're reading the book of Daniel, remember this. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Mordecai, Esther, all were of the same age there. In 597 BC, King Jehoiakim and Ezekiel were taken into Babylon. And the final invasion, 586, destroyed the walls of Jerusalem. Both the temple and the city were burned and exposed to God's judgment. God has no favorites. Now, does this mean that Yahweh met his match in the gods of Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon? Well, the macro-cultural worldview of the day said this. The worldview was, whatever happens down here on earth is what is happening up in the heavens. So now you have the solution is one problem, God's anger against Israel's sin, need of judgment. But that led to another thing. Terrible damage in doing so is being done to God's reputation. Ezekiel views the glory cloud over the mercy seat, then stood over the door of the temple, and then it moved to the east gate. And finally it hovered over the Mount of Olives, and then it disappeared, and that's where we get that word Ichabod. The worst thing that can ever happen to a church is if you could legitimately go out and write Ichabod over the door of a church. The glory of God hath departed. And that is what is happening here. Now, come with me to Jeremiah 29, and we're going to end there. God has a plan. Now, this is what Israel is doing, but God has a plan. Her situation, Israel, she's being judged. She's being judged in a pagan land. And when you come to Jeremiah 29, it's a great chapter. It's a great chapter, but it's at a terrible time. There's a great verse in this great chapter, but it's at a terrible time. It's a letter to the exiles. And when you come here, God says to them, down there, they've been taken captive now in Babylon. And he's saying to them here that, you've lost hope. You've lost hope. Not only have you lost hope, but you don't think there is any hope. Verse 4, it says, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Now, here's what he says. The people are placed in exile for rebelling against God, and here's what God says. First of all, he says, you need to get a homestead. He says, I want you to build houses. First of all, you need a homestead. Second, he says, you need to develop an economic base. He said you need to plant gardens and eat what they produce. Thirdly, you need to be fruitful, marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters, and increase in number too. Do not decrease. Then he says, not only that, but so you've got a homestead, you're developing an economic base, and you're reproducing family. And then he says, I want you to prosper. I want you to prosper and be a blessing. Verse 7, seek the peace and prosperity of the city for which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. In other words, get your eyes off yourself. Don't live in a victim stage, but live in a stage where you are blessing others. And then he goes on, and he says, God says now, God's got a plan. Verse 10, the Lord says, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you. I'll fulfill my gracious promise to bring you out of this place. So you're going to spend 70 years down here in captivity. When that 70 years is up, you're going to have learned some lessons. Then I'm coming to deliver you. And then he says, now this is my plan, verse 11. And for many people, this is one of their favorite verses in the Bible. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. God says, I've got a plan for you, and it's going to get better than it is now, and the future is going to be better than it's been. Not only that, I've got a purpose for you, verses 12 and 13. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. So he says, now, I've got a plan for you, and my plan for you is to prosper you. My purpose for you is, it's based on identity. You have a divine design. You have a divine design, and what does he say there? I want you to come to me. I want you to talk to me, and I want you to seek me, and when you do so with all your heart, declares the Lord. I'll bring you back. So here he gives to his, I'll prosper you, verse 14. He says, this is what I'll do. I'll be found by you, declares the Lord. I'll bring you back from captivity, and I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and I'll bring you back to the place where I carried you into exile. So I'm going to restore you. God's solution will be visible to the nations as the events that caused it. So exiling Israel, God's vindicated his own moral justice through risking his own reputation, so God will act in forgiveness and restoration. Next Lord's Day, I say that every week, next Lord's Day being Wednesday evening, we will look at the return. But tonight you see why God took them into exile, why God judged them, and the other nations are watching all of this. If you treat God this way, this is what God will do. They could watch that and they could come to their own conclusions. Father, thank you. Your word is so full. And we are only touching parts of it. But Lord, thank you for stirring our hearts. For stirring our hearts. And Lord, may it whet our appetite to search and to dig. And Lord, to study the depths of your wonderful story of redemption. For we ask it in the wonderful name of Jesus. Amen. Okay, questions?